New Testament text. I can tell it's going to be heavy duty. I have a Greek New Testament sitting in front of me, so get ready. This is going to be good. But it's great to have had you here, and welcome back to those who are on live streaming with us today. And again, we'll turn the program over to our moderator, the Reverend Lillian Daniel from First Congregational Church of Glen Ellen, Illinois, who has been guiding the conversation today. And this afternoon, presentations from the Reverend Angela Parker, PhD student here at CTS, and the Reverend Sharon Ellis Davis, PhD graduate from CTS and currently Director of African Studies and Black Church, Black Faith at McCormick Theological Seminary, and pastor of UCAN Ministries here in Chicago, among many other things. So, and again, thank you to Will Andrews and to Kevin McLemore, who helped guide our reflections this morning. So, Lillian, thank you, and it's all yours.
Thank you. I have to tease you a little bit, John, because like I'm always talking about the culture of narcissism, and you just named her church. I think you said UCAN Ministries instead of God Can Ministries. Oh, little creeping Arminianism there. So this morning we got to focus, on the Old Testament, on the Psalms. We heard a challenge from Will to say that many of us often neglect the Psalms in our preaching and what that might look like, in particular Psalms of Lament. And then Kevin was sort of challenging us around different approaches to the Scripture that you might use that are unexpected, and how to get out of our own presuppositions around the Isaiah texts and the ways in which they connect to the Christian story. And he gave us some wonderful options, including playing with the idea of using art and other sensate images and things of that nature that would appeal to the sensate folks in the congregation as opposed to just the intuitive people, which is often what we clergy are. So now we get to turn our attention to the New Testament readings, perhaps the more familiar to us, certainly the Gospels, and then we will go to the Epistles. But let us begin with the Gospel readings.
All right, thank you. All right. Good afternoon, all. My name is Angela Parker. I am a PhD student here. Let me turn myself around. Yes. Yes, I'll connect it again, sorry. Thank you. All right, we should come back on shortly. Thank you.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. Thank you. Stay. Like you're training that puppy. Stay. All right. Good afternoon. As I said, my name is Angela Parker. I'm a PhD student here at Chicago Theological Seminary. I am a fourth-year PhD student, and just very happy to be with you this afternoon as we talk about the importance of storytelling for lectionary preaching. Let's take that off the tape. There we go. All right, there you go. The importance of storytelling for lectionary preaching. And so I'm going to give you a way to incorporate storytelling into your preaching. I will focus on the gospel text of Luke 1:46b through 56, which is in week 3 of Most Advent series. But I will also incorporate a little bit of information from the Matthew text as well as we move along. And then even as we move along, I will also incorporate some of the Psalms texts that we've talked about and a few Isaiah texts as well. So holistically, I hope that you would come away with a way to incorporate storytelling into your lectionary preaching, but also give you a few ideas and tips on songs and hymns that you can use in addition to artwork. So it's interesting to me that the conversation has gone to this point, because we'll look at artwork, we will also look at storytelling, because I remember one person said, you have to be able to tell the story as well, but then we'll also look at images and how they can be used to just put together an entire theme for your lectionary preaching or for your worship experience. Because, as we've said, the sermon doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting. You can allow everything that's coming before in the worship to be part of that heavy lifting process. So take some of that pressure off of yourselves as preachers and spread it around, all right? Get your music ministry involved. Just allow other avenues to just get into this worship experience. So that's my opening spiel. But let me tell you a little bit about storytelling. So, storytelling is actually a timeless tradition. And we know that the gospel writer of Luke participates most likely in this storytelling tradition. Luke essentially took memorized, elaborate stories of Jesus and shaped them for generations to come. So what was probably an oral story or was grown out of oral cultures became written in Luke's gospel. And so I do believe that attention to the lost art of storytelling, of oral storytelling, is important not only for biblical exegesis, but also for liberating proclamation of the text. Your proclamation of the text should be transformative. It should be liberative. And so I'm arguing essentially that transformative, liberating preaching can only occur through mastering the art of storytelling for the following 3 reasons. First, stories are memorable. Exegesis allows a preacher to get into the nuts and bolts of a text, and so you can understand the literary context of the text, but if you can begin to connect the text to some kind of story, those compelling stories actually push for transformation in your congregations. Secondly, stories travel. So oftentimes people will come to your services and hear, our pastor preached on blah, 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 but he told this great story about, and then the story travels. So it doesn't just stay in the congregation, but the story goes home as well. And that's the point, so that the story can travel. Also, number 3, stories inspire your auditors to action. So if you can create a story where you have the elements of good storytelling that promote people or move people to action, that's what people are going to take away. What does this story make me want to do? That's the point. All right, so moving on to that. I've told you why stories are important, but I want to talk to you about the importance of a good story. Now, every season, we always have that marathon on of the Christmas story. What is important about a good story can be seen in the Christmas story. And your congregation will watch this movie Christmas Eve. I guarantee some of them will. So, elements of a good story. Basically, you have to have some kind of central premise. In the Christmas story, Ralphie just wants a Red Ryder action rifle for Christmas. That's it. That's what he wants. And also, I don't know if you heard in the news up in Hammond, Indiana, that there's a statue being dedicated to this movie so that when visitors come into Indiana, they can see the classic part where his best friend is triple dog dared to put his tongue on the flagpole. That's important stuff, all right? So you need to know these things, and just sometimes allowing some levity to come in is important so that a story can go down and people can remember it, and then they can remember what you likened that story to in your preaching. So, the premise. You have to find a good premise. 6 elements of good storytelling. You have to find your premise. In the Christmas story, Ralphie wants his Red Ryder action rifle. Number 2, you want to create 3-dimensional characters who change over time. Ralphie, in the beginning of the story, is a certain 9, 10-year-old. But then by the end of the story, he says he really understands the value of Christmas. How does he change over time? He changes through the inner monologue that we hear him as he narrates. We see what he says, or we hear what he actually says, what actually comes out of his mouth. And then he's also very descriptive of what he sees, tastes, hears, feels, and smell. So all of these senses come together in the art of good storytelling. So you're not just telling a bland story, but you're also talking about how people or how your characters feel, or what they're learning, or what they're hearing, what their bodies may be feeling like. So we also, in a lot of our preaching classes, talk about embodiment. You want to take some of that with you as you're mastering this art of storytelling, so that you can preach for transformation and for liberation. Number 3, you have to have a protagonist. Now, don't worry, I have a handout that has these 6 elements of storytelling, so don't feel like you have to get everything, all right? So number 3, a protagonist who is on some sort of a quest. As I've said, Ralphie is on the quest for his Red Ryder action rifle. In Luke, you have Jesus, who's on a quest. At Luke chapter 9, you have this wonderful passage where Jesus says, or the narrator says, and he set his face to Jerusalem. And as we get into the Gospel of Luke and then look at the other Gospels as well, we will see that place and a journey are central to the quest that Jesus is on. So you have to begin to think about, if I'm putting forth a story, can I put forth a story that shows how my protagonist is on their quest? All right. And then number 4, an antagonist, some sort of bully or some sort of person, antagonist, who is bent on stopping the hero. And in the Gospels, we have, unfortunately, Pharisees, Sadducees, Jewish leaders often come up as protagonists. In the Christmas story, Ralphie's protagonists are his mother or his teacher or Santa Claus, who say, you will shoot your eye out if you get this red rifle action rifle. Yes. No, you won't shoot your eye out. And then number 5, you have to have some kind of arch in your story. Some kind of arch that says, either things are seemingly getting better or things are seemingly getting worse. And that's where the theme that we will come to when we get to Luke, the theme of inversion, is going to be important. So already I've given you some clues as to what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about a journey. We're going to be talking about inversions, or reversals, and we've looked at some of that with Psalms, where the psalm writer says, I will not turn back, or especially when Will pointed out the hiphil, the causative hiphil that says, God is turning you, he's causing you to turn. Some of these things are cropping up in the Gospel of Luke and also in Matthew as well. Now, finally, and most importantly, you have to have some kind of conflict in your story. So when we get into Luke, we'll see what the conflicts are, and we'll see how, in the passage that we look at, what that conflict will be. So in essence, I'm arguing that storytelling is important for your preaching, and that in order for it to take effect for your congregation, you must have some kind of background in how to craft a good story. 6 elements of good storytelling. So let me get to some storylines that's happening in Luke's gospel. We'll focus, as I said, on Luke's gospel, but then we'll branch out to some of the other gospels and Isaiah and the Psalms. But in essence, Luke has certain storylines that he has cropping up in the Gospels and also in Acts of the Apostles. So oftentimes, if you do a Bible study on Luke, you also want to include Acts of the Apostles as part of that canon, because that's, one is the beginning and then one is the spread of the church. Storytelling is important in Luke because Luke actually comes up with various themes. He comes up with literary themes and he comes up with narrative themes. And so when you look at what's termed the prologue of Luke, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, you will note that Luke basically sets himself up as a critical editor. He's saying that you have heard stories about Jesus, and there are stories that have come up, but I'm here to give you the concrete story. So, in essence, Luke almost acts as if his story is the be-all and end-all, if you read it in what he's saying. Or are you saying, Luke, that Mark's story is not as good? Or if you knew Matthew's story, it's not as good? We don't know. But those are just some things to be aware of. Because what Luke does is he says, I'm setting up Jesus in a concrete time in history. So in essence, Luke uses this word at verse 4 of chapter 1. And it's the word is like the word asphalt. So in English, we have this idea that asphalt is what we use to ground the road or to build a sidewalk. At Luke chapter 1, verse 4, his wording is something like, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. And so it's like, so that you may know the truth concerning these things that are in asphalt, so to speak, all right? And then what he also does, he's saying, I'm grounding you in concreteness, but I'm also grounding you in history. And history is very important for Luke because as a Hellenistic author, at chapter 1, verse 4 and 1:5 and 2:1, he basically shows himself as a historian by saying that Jesus was born or these things happened in the reign of Caesar Tiberius or in the reign of Tiberius at this time, at this juncture. So Luke gives you this idea of, I'm telling you a story, I'm telling you this story in concreteness, and I'm telling you this story in history. So, part of your stories that you tell, when we're talking about theories or metaphors or theology as we're preaching to people, it's important to ground some of your stories in concreteness and in history so that it's something that people can take with them and kind of hold on to. And see, that's what Luke is trying to do at the beginning of his gospel. Secondly, narrative themes. As I've alluded to, Luke has the themes of reversal or inversion all throughout the gospel, and it also goes into Acts of the Apostles. And so what Luke is essentially doing is that he's showing that even though the early Christians are coming up in a Roman imperial background, God is going to subvert the Roman Empire in some way and will show attention to those who have been at the bottom of society, so that there has to be some kind of inversion or lifting of the oppressed that we've talked about in Psalms 142, or some kind of lifting of the lowly that we've heard about in some of the Isaiah passages. So this inversion is very important for the Gospel of Luke because it's also some of what he's building the dialogue on. So when we get to Luke chapter 1 and Mary's Magnificat, she's dialoguing with some areas from the Hebrew Bible. And so these inversions are going to be important to connect, not just here in the New Testament, but also back to what you are reading in the other Advent passages as well. So the theme of reversal or inversion. Secondly, the journey theme. As I've alluded to, Jesus at Luke chapter 9, sets his place to Jerusalem. For Luke, Jerusalem essentially is the place to be, all right? And what he does, it does something different than the Gospel of Mark, for instance. For the Gospel of Mark, Galilee is the place to be. At the end of Mark, Jesus the angel tells the women to tell the disciples to meet me in Galilee. But Luke is saying, oh, no. Galilee is not the place. Jerusalem is the place. And so this idea of journeying and traveling to some kind of place is going to be important. And it's not just important for Luke, but how many of you sometimes often feel like you're on a journey in this life and you may have started in one spot, but now spiritually you may be in another spot, or even physically. You may have been born in New Jersey, but somehow, some way you made it to Chicago. How did that happen? All right, that's a story right there. All right, but that's what's important for Luke. It's not just about the actual place, but there's a theological reason for this act of journeying. And even in Isaiah 35, which we've talked about this way. And so this way is going to come up in this gospel as well. Third, dual pairings. Luke often pairs people together. Now, what he does in his gospel is that he takes male pairs and pairs them with female pairs. So one example would be the son of Abraham or the daughter of Abraham. And that occurs in Luke, where is it? I know I wrote that down. It occurs in Luke 19:9. And then the daughter of Abraham occurs at Luke 13:16. And so this daughter of Abraham, that's the only time we get this phrase in the New Testament. So where is Luke getting this from? And why is it important to show these pairings, these male pairings with these female pairings? Or even when he's talking about crowds, he talks about the disciples who have traveled with Jesus, but then at Luke chapter 8, he mentions these women who have been traveling with Jesus also, and they've been supporting Jesus out of their resources. So you have these pairings of male disciples, but also female disciples who at first are overlooked, but then all of a sudden, oh, there they are at Luke chapter 8. So Luke is very aware of trying to put these pairings together. Why is that? Some people say, or some commentators say, that he does this because in Jewish tradition, you have to have two witnesses for any kind of court trial. That may be right, but I kind of think it's something different. You can't just preach to 50% of the people. You have to preach to male and to female. And now, because we have so many issues going on in our world, I'm sorry, you just can't preach to heterosexual people. You have to also preach to all kinds of people: heterosexual, homosexual, intersex, queer. And so your preaching now has to begin to take on some kind of storytelling that can include a whole variety of people who may be coming into churches. Because now, guess what? We've put our signs that say open and affirming. Well, you have to begin to preach open and affirming as well. So these are some of the avenues that we have to think about as we're talking about this art of storytelling, or mastering the art of storytelling, or thinking about these pairings that Luke brings about. And fourthly, prophecy. Matthew is often noted as the one who has the prophetic phrase, or the phrase that says, so that the prophets may be fulfilled. Luke does something different with prophecy. We'll see that he pairs, again, this idea of pairing, John and Jesus, I'm thinking that's Matthew. I'm sorry, Matthew does that. John and Jesus, where you have the prophets coming together. But also when we look at Luke 1, we'll see prophetic speech coming out of both Mary and Elizabeth. So in the end, what I'm going to argue or put forth to you is that this idea of prophetic speech oftentimes is more potent, more powerful when it occurs in the pairings with other people. So the prophecy and the prophetic speech that encourages you to keep going, when you're on that road, on that journey, the prophetic speech that you're sharing with your comrade is going to be the catalyst that pushes you forward on your journey when you're dealing with inversions or reversals. So that's what we'll get to in a moment. All right. Here is the text. Take a moment and just read this text to yourselves. You don't have to read it out loud. If you want to, you can read it out loud if you feel like you need to talk. All right, and now I will read the text out loud. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies in the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in the God of my salvation, because he looked on the low status of his female slave or handmaiden or servant. For behold, from now on all generations will call me blessed, because the powerful one has done a great thing to me, and his name is holy, and his mercy is eternal to the ones fearing him. He does a powerful thing with his arm. He scattered the arrogant ones in the thoughts of their hearts. He brought down powerful ones or rulers from their seats or thrones, and lifted up the humble. He filled the hungry with good things and sends away the rich empty. He helped Israel, his servant, in order to remember his mercy, just as he said to our fathers, to Abraham and to his seed in this age." And Mary remained with her, Elizabeth, for 3 months, and she returned to her house. Now, one thing I would like to mention, on your handout, this text, when I got the call for papers, is part of Advent Week 3. But when I saw your handout today, it wasn't on there.